Mark, what a joy to come home to Villanova, a university that is going from strength to strength. Merely to be in this magnificent auditorium is to know that the performing arts are now also getting their time to matter in the education of Villanovans. Villanova was really the place that I grew up, and it's extraordinary to see so many friends here from that time of building ideas and working together. So I'm very, very proud to be here. Among the very first people to greet me when I came to Villanova was Laura Kephart. And so to get to give a lecture that honors Laura, who I see absolutely vividly, she wore an elegant gray Scotch twill suit with a jacket with a matching skirt. She had just that perfect salt and pepper hair. She had intellectual curiosity, a passion for community, and an amazing commitment to Villanova undergraduate history majors. She devoted countless hours to fostering the undergraduate history journal. But most of all, she was there for all of us. She made us feel welcome, and she invited us to do one of the core things that I think Villanova invites everyone who is part of it, which is to have caring and to create community through that caring. And certainly Laura always gave that to me. So I feel a special honor in getting to do this lecture that is in her memory. So let me start with my story. It traveled with the Crusaders as they returned from their battles to claim the Holy Land for Christ, and followed the conquistadors as they conquered the Aztecs. Listen to one who witnessed smallpox during its first deadly visit to the great capital of the Aztec Empire in 1521. The plague lasted for 70 days, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. As one Catholic priest recalled, the Indians died in heaps, like bed bugs. Very important to think about that humans become like bed bugs, because in the story that I'm going to tell around vaccination and anti-vaccination, that boundary between animal and human and that relationship will constantly be queried and troubled in the story that I'm going to tell. Smallpox bound humans together. Smallpox was an instrument of terror, an accessory to the crimes of New World conquest, more lethal than Spanish guns and swords. But it bound humans together through networks of trade, combat, and above all, fear. As it crossed borders, it defied distinctions of class, caste, race, age, gender, status. Princes and paupers alike died of smallpox. Exceptionally contagious, it killed approximately a third of the people who were afflicted by it. It left countless others covered in pockmarks and blinded many. So when an English country doctor in the 1790s, Edward Jenner, noticed that local dairymaids often contracted a kind of cowpox that then immunized them from smallpox, he made what was considered to be a world historical discovery, and that is that a vaccination using things from a cow, hence the word vaccination, could be put under the skin. Cow pustules could be put, pox pustules could be put under the skin of a person, and he believed it would give that person a lifetime immunity from smallpox. So for the first time in history, undoubtedly the most deadly scourge among humanity, there was a promise that it could be eliminated, that there could be a world without smallpox. Jenner became an international hero, an icon of medical benevolence. It took another 175 years to eradicate smallpox. This remains a truly remarkable achievement. Most consider it the single most important achievement in the history of public health. But keep 175 years in mind. That's a long time. As early as 1810, states in Europe began to make smallpox vaccination compulsory. Those who refused or failed to comply faced fines and imprisonment. The British Parliament did so first with the 1853 Vaccination Act, then again in 67, 71, and 98. Public health officials hired medical doctors as public vaccinators who could give free vaccinations to the poor, but they attached them to the single most hated institution in modern British history, the poorhouses created by the odious New Poor Law. People loathed poorhouses. They were nasty, they were degrading, and they were intentionally punitive in that they were designed to force people, to compel people to work under the most awful conditions of labor rather than resort to the welfare and benevolence of the state by living in a poorhouse. They were meant to inculcate, in a sense, a combination of gratitude for the state's uplift and terror at the regimes that were within them. Connecting compulsory vaccination with poorhouses may have made bureaucratic sense. It guaranteed high levels of popular distrust. Think about it. You want to vaccinate huge numbers of people, and you deeply align it with an institution that degrades human beings, even as it claims to offer them a safety net. This was a really, really bad move. It will have extremely long-term consequences, as I will explain, and will help us to make sense of why the most socially marginal in the 19th century often refused to be vaccinated. The campaign against vaccination coincided with vaccination itself. And here you see some famous images. One is of Jenner as the messianic savior, the producer of order, domesticity, and health, and on either side, the monstrosity of vaccination as it promiscuously crosses the animal-human boundary and consumes the innocent lives of children. Forcing a person to be vaccinated, anti-vaccinators quickly realized, that is, compulsory vaccination, handed anti-vaxxers an extraordinarily important and powerful and enduring rhetorical and political tool. Because when you compel a person to have a fluid gathered originally from cowpox pustules into their bodies, this is a very profound violation of bodily integrity and of personal liberty. And it instantly sparked the belief that vaccination was contrary to the most fundamental values that English people and Britons held dear, which were the exaltation of liberty of conscience and freedom and civil liberty as the defining features of Britain as a Protestant nation, and as an empire that would bring these civil liberties to the poor and benighted, superstitious and barbaric peoples of its empire. So what we have set in motion almost immediately then is that anti-vaccinators identify themselves with freedom of conscience, which they bound to their cause, and they viewed as essential to the promotion of a liberal society, which was at the core of how Britons understood who they were. For at its very essence, liberalism was meant to cultivate in each individual person the mechanism of producing right moral action through your freely willed choice. And what is it that makes us act rightly but the prick of conscience? So the freedom of conscience was crucial to the shaping of the liberal subject, who in turn was at the very core of British national identity. Anti-vaxxers got something big when the state decided that compulsion was the way to go. So what happens then is that compulsory vaccination inaugurates the deep and as yet unsettled entanglement between civil liberties, conscience, and smallpox vaccination. And it leads to the chief conscience war that is my subject today. Let me briefly set the scene for the apotheosis, the absolute high point in modern history of conscience as an ethical and political category. So this is the moment when, if you care about conscience above all, it is the triumphant moment. And that moment is in August 1898, when a conservative, pro-vaccination, pro-imperial, racist government, led by Lord Salisbury, for political reasons, smashes through late at the night a clause that invents a new legal person for the first time in history, the conscientious objector to vaccination. This grants the legal right of a person to be an outlaw, to violate law. It stands then as a kind of ethical and legal conundrum. Section 2 of that act, which is really at the core of my lecture tonight, creates this category of the legal person of the conscientious objector. It's an exceptionally badly worded piece of legislation. Nobody knows how to implement it. I've gone through the files. They don't even know what Department of State is in charge of it, much less how do you get it resolved. But there it is, a world historical moment. It was brought through by a radical fringe of women and working class anti-vaccinators who had demanded this clause for decades. Members of the governing Conservative Party, not liberal champions of civil rights, had become anti-vaccinators, unlikely allies. So my talk today will explain how and why this happened and its consequences for Britain, for the empire, and for us today. While anti-vaccinators relished their astonishing victory, many, many feared that smallpox too had achieved a stunning victory in its quest to find unvaccinated, vulnerable human hosts. What's so significant about this then is that the CO had the right, the conscientious objector, to defy a mandated order of the state. This conscientious objector was meant to solve the intractable problem of repeated fines and imprisonments of parents who refused to vaccinate their children, which clearly was inhumane and not working. But I argue it produced and incited a host of extraordinary and even deeper and bigger problems that the British state could not and has not yet resolved about the boundaries between personal freedom, public health, and liberty. This conscience war unfolded along the knife's edge of nation and empire, individual liberties, public health, and competing understandings of our ethical obligations to one another as human persons. The 19th and early 20th century conscience war over vaccination exposed jagged fault lines between rich and poor, men and women, white British citizens, and brown and black subjects. It reproduced and reinforced hierarchies that continue to shape the uneven and unequal way different groups of people access essential healthcare resources in our world today. So my goals are to try to understand the long history of anti-vax. I have found the, I think, single most inspiring and in some ways deeply sympathetic, radical feminist, anti-vax, deeply Christian person to tell that story through, and I've chosen her as the vehicle because she's very hard to dismiss, even as I deeply disagree with her ideas about vaccination. And I think if we want to understand this movement, we have to approach it in some ways from its most articulate and most convincing spokespersons, even as I hope to show some of the problems with her arguments and reasoning. I'm going to explain why something like smallpox vaccination ended up being a conscience war at all. I'll focus on why socially and economically marginal groups of people, both in Britain and its empire, were the grassroots members of campaigns often against it. I'm going to narrate this story from a Christian perspective, focusing on spiritual and religious argument. And I'm going to end with an exploration of how race and racism shaped who across the empire had the right to conscientiously object to vaccination and who was deemed unfit and unworthy of the right to conscientiously object to vaccination. So the 1853 Compulsory Vaccination Act created an army of public health officials, mountains of paper, minutes of notice, a giant bureaucracy all at once. Because once you said that people had to do something, you had to keep track of it. It was compulsion that made conscience matter. And as soon as the Compulsory Act was passed, massive treatises came out which put conscience at the center of the reason why state compulsory vaccination was wrong. Here is one of the most articulate spokesmen for it, Gibbs, who said vaccination's an invader, it dishonors science, it violates liberty of subject, it outrages the finest feelings of the heart, it violates parental love, it violates the spark of the divine nature breathed into man by his heavenly Father. It coerces the parent, he said, either to violate his deliberate, cherished, and conscientious convictions that vaccination is a poison and that it shouldn't be used, and even his religious scruples, and boldly to defy an unjust and tyrannous law. Civil libertarian arguments abounded. People in Ireland were no stranger to them, where a small Anglo-Protestant minority governed a huge peasant, Irish Catholic peasantry. Conscience was at the center of Irish movements for emancipation in the early 19th century. And here is an example from the Belfast newsletter. If compulsory vaccination be good for the body, the newspaper writer thundered, it is evil for the free mind. It trampled upon the sacred rights of conscience and private judgment. Now, it was only in 1867 and 71 when compulsory vaccination was both extended in age, it meant that children under the age of 14 had to be vaccinated, and that the state developed a bureaucratic and policing apparatus that allowed it to impose and enforce penalties. These penalties were fines. If you couldn't pay a fine, your goods would be distrained and your household would be dismantled in order to accumulate the money, or you could be imprisoned. And they could be repeated over and over again for a single child. So these, in fact, imposed a tremendous burden on the poor. It came to produce a discourse of state cruelty. State cruelty worked in several different ways. For anti-vaxxers, they had celebrated examples of the pregnant anti-vax mother who had lost a child she believed to vaccination and would refuse to vaccinate any other ones. Her household goods were taken apart, she was put in jail, and she soon then miscarried. This is a human tragedy. Now, in my view, the rough handling of that mingling of the public health and carceral states bears the responsibility for that tragedy. But for anti-vaxxers, it was vaccination itself that bore that burden. The movement to vaccinate children coincided with the growth of a children's rights movement. I think most of us here today would agree that this is an important development in the history of who has civil liberties and rights that deserve protection, the extension to children. However, the children's rights movement in the 19th century has more than a dark cast to it, because it predicated itself on the assumption of the negligence, incompetence, and cruelty of the working class parent. And these ideas fed into the rationale behind compulsion. You needed compulsory vaccination because poor parents just couldn't be bothered to vaccinate their kids. They didn't care enough. So within this mix, enter the stars of this part of my talk, Mary Catherine Hume and her fiancé, the erstwhile Anglican clergyman William Rothery. Mary Catherine Hume was the daughter of a Scots surgeon who had magically, in a 5-year period in the late 1790s and early 1800s, turned his penniless bank account and sharp mind into an immense fortune, and had returned to Britain a very, very wealthy man. He's called a nabob. And this is a quintessential empire story in which we know almost nothing about the structures of extraction of wealth and of corruption that produced this fortune. But when her father, the most famous radical champion of the rights of the working poor, Joseph Hume, came home, he was a wealthy man, he enters Parliament, and he has this remarkable daughter, Mary Catherine, to whom he gives every possible educational advantage and freedom, and in whom he inculcates a keen sense of justice. Mary Catherine remained single at the age of 40 until she met William Rothery. Now, this is a very great age for a wealthy, talented woman to remain single. They find each other through the Swedenborgian church. Emmanuel Swedenborg was a great polymath naturalist, theologian, thinker from Sweden who had a small but ardent following in Britain. He believed that the Trinity was bunk and that the goodness of God was in singular and unity. So he's a radical Protestant. He believed that God was the embodiment of love, and that hell and damnation were the creations that violated truly what Scripture meant. And he believed in a radical vision of conjugiality, which combined a diverse, sweet equality between the sexes, in which if you had a good marriage, and everybody, you need to decide whether you'd like this, you actually got to be with your spouse in the spirit world. So you were really together for a long time. So when Mary Catherine finds William through Swedenborgian circles, they fall in love and they decide to create this conjugal partnership. Now, Mary Catherine Hume, I would argue, is actually a very significant woman writer and woman of letters and thinker in the 19th century, almost wholly forgotten. She rewrote Sappho, who you might connect to Sapphism, which is to say female same-sex love, or the great woman poet of antiquity. She made her into a radical Christian feminist who, in her poem to Sappho, celebrated this sweet, diverse equality designed in fullest freedom, but male and female both as equal men to know and love and serve their Lord first. Mary Catherine believed that allopathic doctors, that's the doctors that most of us go to see, that's not homeopaths, not naturopaths, not spiritual healing. It is the kind of medicine that we understand, that allopaths had become the popes of modern Britain, and that through public health, they had forged an alliance that gave them a monopoly over caring for the bodies of people. And that this system by which allopaths got credentialed was linked to their status in being the only people who could vaccinate, the only people who could register births. So she had a profound insight, and one that I don't dispute, which is that the growth of the state and of public health happened through a narrowing and exclusion of a wide range of forms of healing and medicine in order to favor one group of doctors. And this would have a really profound impact both in the empire and at home. The maternal was political for this radical, difference-based, but equally equality-centered feminist. And here's what I mean by that. Married at age 40, she promptly got pregnant. She carried the pregnancy to full term. In the midst of her labor, a, quote, male midwife obstetrician entered the birthing chamber. Her contractions ceased, and that unborn person at 9 months died. Now, it's hard to imagine that tragedy. William was 44. I'm sure that they thought the chance of having a child would never come again. These were people who had waited a long time. She she produced a deep structure in which she argued that the long-term banishment by allopathic male doctors of midwives and women from control over the birth process was part of a malign way in which the state was sanctioning medical patriarchy and the disempowerment of women. Now, maternal instinct played a huge role in making her an anti-vaxxer. When she successfully did have a child 2 years later, this was obviously a source of great joy. She vaccinated the child, and then 3 months later, the child developed large boils on his skin. Now, small children develop a tremendous amount of irritations, and their skin is very sensitive. And the doctor said that it was related to teething and an impacted tooth that was trying to come out. She and William did not believe it. They believed that it had been caused by vaccination, and even though the boils receded, it left them deeply scarred. And they came to believe that if God is love and God is a source of all purity, then God, as the divine healer, could not possibly sanction the putting in of an impure substance, vaccine, into the body of a pure baby. Together, then, they transformed conjugiality and their idea of equality and difference within difference between men and women to become founders of the National Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League and its remarkable journal. The anti-vax then had a gender from the outset. On the one hand, it was grounded in a critique of medical patriarchy, which was linked to the idea that churches could be in bed with the church, with the state, as having an official state church, and both were systems of exploitation of vulnerable bodies. Mary Catherine Hume also had another significant insight. Coincident with vaccination was a system that I hope many of you will find grotesque, and that is a series of laws passed called Contagious Diseases Acts, in which venereal disease, responsibility for it, was placed exclusively and solely on women's bodies and on the policing of women's bodies. And in particular, female sex workers, prostitutes, or fallen women were subject to being picked up on the streets, even without evidence that they were engaging in sex trafficking, and subjected to a compulsory physical examination by a male doctor called specular rape, in the sense that this instrument is being put in and then locked up and literally made unfree persons in locked hospitals. She linked compulsory vaccination to that as the invasion of an overmighty state into the bodies then of the most vulnerable and marginal. She linked this to a deep vision of a loving God as the true source of all healing. Vaccination defies the law of him who give life and form to soul and body alike. Women, she believed, had an intimate and sex-specific proximity to God because mother love draws them more closely to his divine nature. Now, all of this activity and organizing made the Hume-Rotheries into key experts about anti-vaccination or the evils of vaccination. But both of them despised expertise as part of the monopoly that male doctors and others had. So what they inaugurate is that they believe that their expertise is rooted in divine and universal Christian principles about love and healing and purity. And medical experts, they believe, could not possibly give disinterested and honest evaluations of vaccination because they're bound up in a system that gives them financial benefits when they vaccinate people. William Hume-Rothery had his starring moment between the parliamentary inquiry about vaccination. Now, to read these hundreds and hundreds of pages is to encounter a remarkable archive of individual lives of poor people whose children, after they were vaccinated, sometimes 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, 15 years, suffered horrible medical maladies. To give an example, one child had been vaccinated from the arm of a neighboring child. And the family gave testimony and they said, all of us are very healthy and robust. But our daughter at age 2 developed a cancer on her face. We asked our neighbors from whom we got whose child's arm gave us the vaccine for our child, because in that day there was often arm-to-arm vaccination. And they say, oh yes, cancer runs through our family. Okay, we really have to work hard here. On the one hand, this is absurd, and every single argument that William Hume Rothery made before the parliamentary inquiry, I can say, having read with the fullest open heart and mind that I could give it, falls to nothing. It is illogical. It depends upon a conflation of a sequence or a loose correlation with causality. How do we make sense then of the power? And for me, this is one of the deep insights of anti-vax in the 19th century. Poor people had extraordinarily limited access to health care. They lived under terrible conditions of everyday life, under malnutrition, and terrible things happened to them and their bodies as in a system that saw them as labor to be extracted to use for capitalist purposes. Vaccination provided an explanation for their misfortunes. It has an affective logic that we, at our peril, mock. We need to understand it, even as this war against facts seems so unlikely and so unsupportable. Anti-vaccinators, because of these campaigns of folks like the Hume Rotherys, gained ground in the 1880s and 90s. But other factors, not just moral and political rhetoric and argument and images and campaigns and speeches, had an impact. There were frequent breakthrough cases of people who had been vaccinated against smallpox. Because the supply of it was irregular, people were not often getting their boosters. Boosters often happen between the age of 10 and 15. Sometimes people would have another booster in their 20s to give them more of a lifetime immunity. And to be sure, the conditions under which people got vaccine, the technologies for its delivery, its manufacture, were extraordinarily uneven, not just in England and Britain, but globally. And in question and answer, I'd be happy to discuss the kind of supply of vaccine, particularly in British India, and the huge variations and issues around that. What this means then is that in some areas that were heavily vaccinated, people were still dying of smallpox. And of course, the extent to which this was a factor that could be explained entirely in terms of the unvaccinated was very difficult to prove these things. Also, anti-vaxxers got smart, and here I'm sure you'll hear echoes of today. They understood that vaccination happened locally through boards of guardians from this hated institution of the poor law. They decided to make anti-vaccination a single vote issue. And they went in localities and they took over by having people elect anti-vax boards of guardians, in which the people who were there meant to force compulsory vaccination didn't believe in it and in fact had politically committed themselves against it. And so this creates massive civil disobedience across Britain in which elected officials are doing the will of the people, which violates the law itself. This leads to a parliamentary inquiry of 1889 to 96, in which there's a huge tussle about the question of conscience. Anti-vaxxers on the committee knew this. Conscience being linked to anti-vaccination was the key to its success in political life. Pro-vaccinators on this committee of inquiry said, conscience has nothing to do with this. Why don't we say if a parent has an honest objection, which implies the possibility that other objections are dishonest, then on a one-by-one case basis, we will allow people not to vaccinate. But who won? When the law was passed, the anti-vax lobby succeeded in creating the Section 2 of the 1898 Vaccination Act that created that new legal person, a conscientious objector to vaccination. The conscientious objector to vaccination had profound consequences for Great Britain that consisted of 4 nations, England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and a vast and diverse, religiously diverse and ethnically and racially diverse empire. Now, I want to bring my lecture to its central, I think, point of both insight and, I think, extraordinary pain for us living today, which is the extent to which this entire story about the conscientious objector, a person whom one could easily have sympathy for, and who doesn't believe that freedom of conscience matter, that this entire debate happened around and through race and racism. So to understand this story of race and racism, I want to briefly detour to British colonial India in the 19th century. India was famously the jewel in the crown, the most important, largest, and populous of the colonies in Britain's vast imperium. It was also the place of an extraordinarily ancient political, social, and cultural and religious life. Within colonial, vaccination had come to India through a literal chain of human infant arms that stretched from Britain to India early in the 19th century. Now, Britons viewed both Muslims and Hindus in India as saturated by their religious beliefs. Religion, it was impossible for them to imagine Indians without thinking of them as religious. But unlike the way that they linked Christianity with enlightened truths that would inform the right workings of conscience to make good moral choices and become liberal subjects, they believed that the religion that saturated Muslims and Hindus was, in the case of Muslims, tainted by an essential fanaticism that would lead to violence, and with Hindus, with barbarism and superstition. So in other words, the religiousness of these populations were encoded as contrary to the enlightened truths of Christian conscience. Now, some Hindus did object on religious grounds to the cruel use of calves as a source of lymph. And there were images that circulated both in Britain and elsewhere of the actual cruelty to cows that is involved in the extraction of lymph. I won't be too graphic, but to say, I'll just give you a little. Cows were put on their backs, which cows really, really do not want to be on their backs. Their legs were put up, they were bound. 2 cows were put next to each other. One that had a cow pustule was then used to bring the cowpox to the other cow. Around 70 incisions were made in the body of a cow in order to make it, in a sense, a living manufacturer of usable lymph. Among Hindus, smallpox was both embodied and in some sense could be cured through the veneration and worship of the goddess of smallpox, Sitala or Shitala. She's pictured here. Now, for colonial administrators, worshiping a goddess in order to alleviate smallpox was the height. It proved to them how unworthy of being treated as if they were conscientious moral subjects Indians were. This is, in fact, a profound misreading of the nature of Shitala and the ways in which her veneration was crucial in any number of ways to the actual care of people with smallpox. Let me just briefly elaborate this for a minute or two. I'm not going to give a whole lecture on it. But first of all, you see the goddess Shatala embodied the humor of coolness. Within Ayurvedic medicine, there were 3 humors, and coolness was one of them. For people suffering from extraordinary fevers and smallpox pustules, coolness was, in fact, at least a way to alleviate pain. And you see her holding a pot of cool water, which was a native leaf that gave some relief from the pain of smallpox, was dipped in water and then applied to the surface. Crucially, the offerings of food that were brought to Shatala were also distributed among poor people so that they had a stronger caloric constitution as they faced the prospects of disease. None of this worship of Shatala, however, dissuaded the reforming Muslim educational reformer Sir Syed Ahmad Khan from trying to push through compulsory legislation for vaccination in India. He said, look, personal liberty is really important. He praises, in a way that many post-colonial scholars, and me included, find a kind of, in a sycophantic way, British colonial rule. He says Britain has brought this great gift of personal liberty and its privileges that have been conferred upon the countrymen by British rule. But, he says, no respect for personal liberty would justify the harm which the ignorant Indian parent does to his neighbor by convening infection. This was too radical a move. After the 1857 uprising or mutiny, British colonial legislators were extraordinarily attentive to religious matters as potentially a disruption of colonial rule, inciting military insurrection and civil disobedience. And the Viceroy, Lord Ripon, for whom this Compulsory Vaccination Act was the very first piece of legislation he confronted, believed that it was a question involving very delicate considerations. So instead of imposing compulsory vaccination, what they did is they said it was compulsory, but each municipality in India could decide for itself whether it wished to adopt it. It was permissively compulsory. And more crucially, there was a class of persons called honorary magistrates who had the discretionary right to exempt parents. So the key here was, we say that we're going to compel Indians to get vaccinated, but we will not inflame religious prejudice by forcing it, and we allow local groups to make that decision. Now, I give you this as background because the debate about whether there should be a conscientious objection to vaccination and whether, in its relationship to compulsory vaccination, happened explicitly in the 2 houses of Parliament, the upper house, the House of Lords, and the lower house, the House of Commons, with the question of, could black and brown people in empire be granted conscientious exemption also? Listen to this debate. The Earl of Feversham asked why the conscientious objector, being a small minority of the population, is to be placed in opposition to the general well-being of the country. Are not the conscientious objections of the majority to be considered? Lord Aldenham declared, there are conscientious objectors in India also to whom we pay no attention at all, though their objections are really conscientious, bound up with their religion. I want to know where we are to stop if we once yield to the conscientious objector. Lord Stanmore noted that if experience has shown us that where restrictions imposed with a view of securing and safeguarding the public health have been relaxed, to relax them is to give conscientious objection, to no longer make it compulsory. That relaxation will be extended to India and the colonies. This, he believed, threatened colonial rule and public health there. Indian intellectuals were quick to respond to this debate in Britain. The Indian-owned, crusading, nationalist, Kolkata-based newspaper Amrita Bazar Patrika put the matter bluntly on August 14, 1898. If the conscience of the minority is respected in England, why should not the same be done in India? Why not, indeed? Let us hear the brazen, unapologetic answer of the Marquess of Salisbury, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the leader of the Conservative Party. His reply lays bare the racist nationalism at the heart of empire and the Conservative Party's approach to it. It is bold, it is explicit. It makes no apologies for its claims. The difference, he explained, between conscience in Britain and India resides entirely in the nature of the men for whom conscience is claimed. They are Englishmen, he explained. It is no use to quote me the precedents of India and Ceylon. Put simply, Englishmen have consciences to be protected. Indians do not. Explicitly then, in Parliament, when the conscientious objector was invented as a legal category in modern history, through the right to not vaccinate your children, that person was born white. And that person's rights hinged on race-based exclusions across the empire. Now, Lord Salisbury agreed to this measure, the conscientious objector, because he said, let's defang the anti-vax movement. Let's take away their civil liberties argument, and as more and more people are vaccinated, the movement will die. So he actually said it was a delusion, and in conceding what it wanted, he believed that he would kill it. Let me think a little bit about the aftermaths of this story. Once again, we hear the repeated claim that the only real conscientious objectors to vaccination are in India, but in fact, nobody has considered allowing conscientious objection to be valid in India. The invention of the conscientious objector to vaccination posed a profound threat to British claims to civilizational superiority and to global health. Throughout the world, people said that Britain had given up its claim to be a leading nation, that it had threatened to make itself into an epicenter of the next pandemic of smallpox, and that how could it claim to be the center of enlightenment when it had caved in to fanatical, crankish anti-vaccinators. The consequences of these decisions reverberated across the empire. And here I'm going to give you only two examples of the convergence of racism and conscience in Natal, South Africa, and as it plays out in Victoria, Australia. It's a complicated story, and I'm going to thin it out for you. The Legislative Assembly in Australia was debating the terms of extending the right to conscientiously object to vaccination. They called for the expert testimony of John Stuart Helps. Helps was the son of an anti-vaccinator doctor who had emigrated to southern Africa and to Natal. He was a farmer. He was a blatant racist. He argued that Indians were an inherently filthy people, and he believed that Zulu people, who he used a pejorative term, the K word, which is a crime to say in southern Africa, but derives from an Arabic word for a foreigner, were incapable of higher thought. But what's so fascinating about his testimony is what it reveals about the racial politics of conscience and vaccination in Natal. He argues, the Indian coolie he proclaimed is the filthiest individual possible, and he noted with chilling, unapologetic candor, I think the men who run South Africa do not believe that a Zulu person has such a thing as a conscience. Vaccination was compulsory because of the demands of the extraction of labor for workers in South Africa meant that the controllers of labor wanted to minimize the amount of time that workers were sick. And there was a belief that Zulu persons were incapable of the work of being a moral subject, a moral liberal subject in determining whether they had a conscientious objection. This also plays itself out in British India. A deputy commissioner of Hisar district in the Punjab says, smallpox vaccination should not be compulsory there. And he really makes a powerful argument. And this is a person who knew and lived among the people with whom he worked. He said, in this district at any rate, compulsory vaccination is not yet wanted. We must let people live their own lives if we are trying to inculcate them in habits of self-government. If we want them to become liberal subjects, they need to be able to make choices. He was overruled by his boss. And this is the logic, the contorted logic that his boss used to insist that voluntary vaccination was a threat and a menace to India and to the province. Listen to his contortions. Parents in Hisar who failed to vaccinate their children were not adverse to the operation on grounds that appeal to the conscience, as in Europe, but on those that are purely selfish, or such as appeal to the spirit of procrastination that is one of the curses of India. It is no doubt the case that the Hisar people are more ignorant than those of some other districts. Indians passively procrastinate rather than actively anticipate their children's medical needs. Only colonial medical benevolence can save them and India from smallpox and themselves. Let me turn to 3 conclusions. One on conscience, one on race, and one on liberalism. Conscientious objection to vaccination was the solution to the repeated failure of parents to vaccinate and this crisis of forms of civil disobedience among people. But itself became an enduring problem for those required to adjudicate its claims. How do you know if a person has true conscientious objections? What mechanisms, what technologies for exploring the inner workings of a person's moral personhood can be used to make those truths? But even more importantly, if vaccination marked the apogee of conscience as it enters into law and creates a new legal person, it also portended, many believed, civilizational decline, and it fed into fears of the way in which the empire was imploding through its own degenerate forces. In other words, late 19th century was obsessed with questions of the decline of the West. Here, when the great imperial state allows faddish COs to win out, surely this is a symptom of the broader decline of the West and of the British Empire. So if it was the apogee of conscience, it also, for many, portended the low point for both nation and empire. I've suggested that we cannot view the invention of the conscientious objector as a race-neutral phenomenon, that because of the trans-imperial lens and the extent to which people in Parliament explicitly discussed and debated which people could have conscience and which ones could not, we need to understand that the invention of the CO as a legal person coincided with an explicit claim that that person would be white and an implicit claim that that person would be Christian. And as my example showed, this would have long-term legacies in the 20th century about who did and did not have the right to claim conscience-based rights. Finally, conscientious objection as a problem for liberalism. And here I'll only sketch it in the very, very briefest of manners. The legal invention of the conscientious objector to vaccination provided the precedent as well as the legal bureaucracy that was used during World War I to decide whether a person had a conscientious objecting to take the life of another human being. This precedent, which was crucial to liberal moral action, you create a conscientious objector so that people get to make conscientious choices, exercise their will. That belief was essential to liberalism, But the liberal wartime government that governed during the opening hostilities of World War I confronted the conscientious objector to war as both the thing that it had created and as the nemesis that it could never figure out how to solve. Because the very possibility of granting conscientious objections based on the inward feeling that taking another person's life threatened the morale and machinery of the wartime state at its moment of greatest demand to serve the nation at arms. The CO, in so many ways, was the problem that shipwrecked the Liberal Party during World War I and led quite literally to the end of the Liberal Party. And thus, I would suggest that the conscientious objector, invented by the conservative imperial government that did not care about liberal principles, was a kind of Trojan horse that entered the house of liberalism and faced it as an intractable problem that it has not yet resolved. Thank you. Please, and would you mind saying your name? So I wouldn't argue that smallpox itself contributed to the kind of decline of Britain and its empire. But in broadest terms, and this is what I think is one of the enduring insights of the anti-vax movement, is that the politics of controlling the bodies of the poor, who form the labor that fuels global capitalism, that the effort to regulate and control and maximize the profits that can be extracted from their labor deeply informs vaccination policy. And so that in British India had to be balanced with a keen awareness of the rising forces of anti-colonial nationalism and the anxieties that any infringement of religious convictions could spark political unrest. So there's a kind of interesting balancing act, and there is not a uniform policy across the empire. But I would, in this one way, grant to anti-vaccinators that the key investment of the British Empire in vaccination is around the extraction of labor and the way that it is essential for the production of global capitalism. And I would also grant the 19th century anti-vaccinators that they saw and grasped an insight that the carceral state, the state that punishes and locks people up, and literally the system of policing, which was first used in the vocabulary of the very founders of public health. The word police in the vocabulary of 1830 public health officials is not actually referring to people in uniforms, but is referring to the disciplining of unruly, dirty, and filthy populations that need to be cleaned up. But in the 1830s witnesses the rise of actual police forces, the rise of public health, and both of them congeal in this vaccination, in the creation of the state apparatus of vaccination. And they literally coincide by using the same mechanisms. And that's a very, very profound insight. And it's not one that we can dismiss, as much as I'm very happy to dismiss the individual arguments. So that And those mechanisms of policing those bodies were themselves part of preserving and reproducing a viable workforce. What I didn't really have time to explain is that the very core of this poor law apparatus was to make receiving state-supported welfare so undesirable that you would take the very lowest paid, worst job in the outside world. It was called the Less Eligibility Clause. It bold-facedly was an attempt to buttress capitalism because you wanted to create workers. And look, right now, I've recently had opportunity to be in very different parts of this great country, and I have had to hear powerful arguments which really turn my stomach, in which small business persons are saying, we can't hire workers because we need to pay them too much, or they'd rather get money from the government. I'm thinking this is potentially a moment where a decent human living wage can become pervasive in our world. But I understand that argument that if you're running a small business and you can't hire anybody, you're really at a difficult place. Well, this debate in the 19th century was really about that. It was about making sure that capital would have a workforce. So I hope I've been able, I know that's a lot of different pieces, but that's part of the, if you will, the embedded infrastructure of the talk that I had to say too quickly in order to get to the conscience and vaccination one. Oh. Yes. Oh, yeah. In workhouses, it's completely forced labor, and in plantation labor in Natal is not a form of free labor.
So, in the end, in the vaccination policy, if there had not been a conscientious objection, if it had been hypothetically enforced, do you think that would have had any impact on the?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I'm equipped to answer that. I will tell you that huge numbers of people took advantage of the Conscientious Exemption Clause, and by 1907, the British state decided to get rid of compulsory vaccination because, in a sense, it is an example of a movement from below. It did, of course, continue to use vaccination very, very vigorously. And what I didn't have time to tell you is that the 1898 Act marked a really significant breakthrough in the technology of vaccination. It got rid of arm-to-arm vaccination in England and in Wales, and it created a uniform supply of glycerinated lymph, which made it impossible for vaccines to pass on other opportunistic diseases like erysipelas or syphilis and any other diseases that might sometimes have been communicated from arm to arm. So there were some really important advances in it. I think, Marcus, you had your hand up.
Okay. Well, thanks, Seth. This was really fascinating. Two quick questions. The first one goes to the motivational story that you tell, right, of the anti-vaccine movement. You tell it through the cues, which are a very sort of upper middle class story, but then you also hint that there was a strong anti-vax movement among the working classes. What sort of evidence do you have in order to get insight into the motivational factors of the working class, particularly in light of the fact that you also have this story that vaccination violates certain liberal principles, and so I'm wondering how deeply embedded those liberal principles were in working class anti-vax.
So let me answer that first question. So I alluded to the hundreds and hundreds of testimonies of the working poor about the impacts of vaccination. So one of the great gifts of doing British history or British imperial history is that the state recognized knowledge as power very early. And it produced a vast apparatus for the gathering of knowledge. And from the 1830s, it collected the testimony of the objects of state action, like the working poor, who were brought in. So there are literally, within the giant appendices of the succession of parliamentary inquiries into vaccination, hundreds and hundreds of pages in which working class witnesses come up and tell their stories. That was how I made the argument about the affective logic of in a sense, explaining catastrophe in their lives. So these rank and file people are not silenced in the archive. They speak in their own voices, but they do so under very particular conditions of cross-questioning by members of parliamentary committees, who will often lead these people to, they attempt to get these various witnesses to acknowledge the weakness of the causal link between vaccination and the bad health outcomes in their families. That is something that these witnesses refuse to do. And there's a way in which you have to feel both the immensity of the pain, but also the pride and power of these parents who refuse to be cowed by these leading scientists and members of parliament who are trying to teach them that they are wrong to be anti-vaccinators. So that's part of what makes it so robust. There are also local histories, which I've gone into, which are led by working class communities in which they elect boards of guardians that are anti-vaccinators. And they produce both print archives and a range of other kinds of materials, Marcus, that allow us to see their argument. I chose Mary Catherine Hume in particular because the history of conscience has largely, to the extent that it exists, has been told as a story about men. And so I wanted to recenter it by having a female protagonist. And the history of vaccination has been told largely in the West as a story of secularity, which is contrasted with the religiosity of debates around health among Hindus, Muslims, and other non-Christians. So my effort to narrate the story here was to break down that divide between East, West, secular, religious, rational, irrational. So that was the method, if you will, for behind the madness of my choice. Professor Kulski.
Yes, Professor Koven. It's kind of a question that links to what Marcus is asking, and I feel like possibly one causal explanation that you might address is the question of democracy. So in Britain, you're talking about parliamentary hearings and pressure put on the government so that anti-vaccination is almost linked to an expanded democracy, whereas in
Beautiful.
India, which is an authoritarian government in which it's not just, I mean, race is important, but there's also an authoritarian government in which colonized subjects don't have the opportunity to, give testimony and, and to plead their case, as it were. And so I just thought that might be another kind of analytical way of thinking through, right? Democracy and authoritarianism.
I love that democracy and authoritarianism. It doesn't entirely map. So the 1918 example is really crucial, and Professor Kulski is a world-class expert in the history of South Asia and empire. But 1918 is a very important year because in 1918, the British colonial state decides that it will foster democracy in all of the provinces of India, while it simultaneously will extend the kind of martial law of wartime in the aftermath as the end of World War I is looming. So it engages in a double gesture. It fosters democracy by creating overwhelmingly South Asian populated new forms of legislative assemblies and councils. And the example I gave in Hisar is that the deputy lieutenant says, we are trying to create democracy in England. We are trying to fulfill this 130-year promise of making Indians into liberal moral subjects. We're getting close. Because, in fact, through a very huge archive that I've been able to get into, Indians during World War I began to debate the right to have conscientious objection in a huge way. Now, that story was around the right to conscientiously object to getting Christian doctrine in their schools. They didn't want it. And this produces an immense and dangerous movement during World War I around conscience. And the British colonial state is monitoring this. They then are granting this expanded democracy in 1918. And what we see is exactly, I think, Professor Kulski gives this fantastic conceptual frame. Because the deputy commissioner wants to foster democracy. So democracy wins, and he says, let this local community decide whether they're going to want compulsory vaccination or not. It's the authoritarian boss who trumps him and says, no, we're not going to do that because these people are lazy, ignorant, they don't have consciences, we can't possibly do that. So I love your framework, and I think it will really be useful for me in thinking about it empire-wide. And it's yet another one of those complex ethical dilemmas we as historians face, because the 19th century anti-vax movement did have important connections to popular democracy, and we can't pretend that it doesn't. Other questions? Yes. And you are?
Hi, I'm Claire.
Hi, Claire.
So, to be entirely frank, you sort of have to be living under a rock a little bit not to see the parallels between this lecture and
Thank you.
I mean, even the language you use with like anti-vax, and it's clearly the mark of somebody who's living 21st century. And the anti-vax movement that has existed in the United States for a couple of decades now, that arose largely as people know or may not know how to sort of now debunked scientific studies about vaccinations and autism,
Right.
and the way that has transitioned post-COVID and the rise of vaccines for COVID. So I guess my question is sort of, do you think that there is a link between the conscientious objector of the 19th century and the early movements of anti-vaccination started in the 1990s and early 2000s in the U.S. and the version of the anti-vaxxer we know today? And do you think it comes from a similar place? Do you think there's a parallel, or do you think that there's actually more of a difference? And I guess the bigger question is, what is the lesson that you really want us to take away from the insights of the smallpox vaccination?
Right. I'll begin with some affinities. 19th century anti-vaccination movements understood that health, healing, and medicine were polyvalent, that there were multiple forms of ways of knowing the body and of healing the body. And they spoke for groups like homeopathy, naturopathy, forms of spiritual healing. In the colonial context, there's a huge, in fact, I would say the majority of healthcare provision in colonial context was outside the boundaries of Western colonial medicine. So that there's a kind of the fantasy of the omnipotence of Western allopathic medicine in its conquest of the world is belied by the everydayness of alternative forms of healthcare, which in fact often do provide various forms of effective care for the people who receive them. And the contemporary movement against vaccination does, at some parts of it, connect to critiques of the domination of a singular way of thinking about medical health. And there is a fairly well-documented connection in which anti-vaccinators recognize the yoga community and others who are engaging in a range of mind-body practices that lie outside of the traditional purview of Western medicine. So there is a kind of affinity there, or at least there is a kind of resemblance. You rightly noted, by the way, they were really understood as anti-vaxxers back then too. So it's not an anachronism that their title was the anti-vaccinator compulsory, but of course, you're right that I began this research around 5 years ago, but in trying to think it through for today under the experience of COVID, of course, the present is shaping this. I think when you ask what lesson is the takeaway, For me, the single most important lesson is the 19th century story, like our story today, fractured along lines of economic and social status, as well as race and other markers of difference that produced deeply significant hierarchies about the kinds of resources human beings could access and possess. And that when we confront groups of people who have a distrust of public health in its alliance with the state, we need to remember that they had good reasons for having distrust. I say these things as a person who believes deeply in vaccination. I wouldn't have come here if I didn't believe there were protocols for keeping you safe and for me safe. But I think it's about the humility that a historian needs to bring to understand that people in the past had reasons for taking the actions that they did, and for bringing our sympathetic imagination to bear on what made those things both feel and seem right to them. And so I think that's part of the commitment that I hope I have at least given some evidence of in the way I've told the story. Other things are for you to take away. I don't want to overdetermine the mapping of it. I know several of my friends, some in this room, said, "Are you going to make all of the connections to today?" And I said, I'm pretty sure the audience is going to decide what connections it wants to make. Okay, you're in the dark. Yes, hi there.
Hi, how are you? I have a question.
Tell us your name.
I'm Emmanuel Swedenborg, professor in political science.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture and your talk. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how far into kind of decolonization your research looks at, especially with regard to spaces like India. I'm asking this question because a couple years ago, Jessica Pearson published a book on global politics of health that dealt with decolonization and the kind of triangulation of decolonization, French colonial state, and the emergence of the UN and the WHO.
No. And I haven't read that. That sounds like a great book for me to find and read. Jessica Pearson. Thank you for the reference. So my story is going to end in 1923. By the way,
My question
okay.
was that in the French colonial space after World War II, when the French state begins to extend citizenship rights to colonial subjects in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the things that starts to happen is people expect that with the expansion of citizenship rights in Africa that there'll be this huge push to expand public health provision in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that happens alongside that is that Africans begin to use their newly acquired citizenship rights to opt out of French state's kind of colonial public health projects, because they now can claim we are now equal to French colonists and we can now opt out of your vision for expanding public health. And I was wondering if there was anything similar that started to happen in a space like India with these kinds of civil liberties and political representation that begins after World War I, that really expands after World War II with decolonization and independence.
Well, thank you for sharing that important story of that kind of opting out. The work of Sarah Stein on the Sahel has actually shown that in the 1920s, in a part of the Sahel that was viewed as not France, Jewish occupants actually aligned themselves with public health, and they did it in the 1920s as a way to begin to try to assert and produce a kind of genealogy of Frenchness that would eventually give them citizenship rights, but Muslims did not. And in fact, they refused to use the public health centers there, which set in motion part of the drama of the kinds of issues around rights in the aftermath of World War II there. So my research is going to end in 1923, and which is the moment when the colonial state first grants the right to conscientiously object to being Christianly educated in India, and it's a kind of the culmination of a campaign, one of many, of anti-colonial nationalists. But colonial medicine was an exceptionally fraught terrain, and British administrators as well as doctors understood that the imposition of colonial medicine would never be more than partial and incomplete. So to give an example, I want to make sure, and stop me if I'm going off on a tangent that's not the answer to your question. I think what you're asking is, to what extent in the story of India is there resistance to Western medicine, and when and how does it ally to forms perhaps of nationalism? Okay, so the beginning of the story is not per se articulated through a discourse of nationalism, but it is through a discourse of anti-colonial resistance. And that is, in India, the colonial state recognizes that unlike in Britain, where it outlaws variolation, which is inoculating a person using desiccated cells from another person who had smallpox. So inoculation, you transfer material of a person who had smallpox, and then you give it to another person so that they will have a mild case of smallpox. In Britain, when vaccination achieves its first triumph with the first Vaccination Act of 1840, inoculation is rendered illegal, and inoculators are not allowed to practice that form. In India, they realize that's impossible. Variolation has extraordinarily deep roots, and sometimes the very same categories of subcaste peoples called bagats, a jati, of people who are lower caste and perform this function can, in the Punjab at least, the scholar Lauren Minsky has shown that the very same people sometimes performed variolation, which would be an indigenous healing and therapy, and vaccination, depending on the context, depending on the availability of lymph. Lymph supply in various parts of places like the Punjab was very, very short. It was very difficult to get it. So in fact, there's a much more agile understanding that I think is reflected in the policy of colonial rule of Lord Ripon, who said this is a very delicate matter. And I think it's what led to this contradiction in terms of being permissively compulsory, in that different groups get to decide whether it's compulsory, but at the local level. Well, let's be real. It makes no sense, if you're trying to stop a pandemic, to say that Pune can have doesn't have vaccination, but Sattar or Ahmednagar or Bombay do. This spreads, but so keenly aware were they of these issues of local circumstances and different competing systems, really, of how to deal with smallpox. So did that at least gesture at an answer for you? Okay, well, come up afterwards and pin me down for a better answer. But I don't deal with decolonization per se, so at the core of your question is it's just outside where my story goes.
So this is one from Seth Koven. I'm just going to summarize. Do you see any analogous histories of anti-vax movements that emerge spontaneously in other cultures and religions, sort of non-Western? So you're talking about decolonization. But what about, say, for example, Japan? I'll add that. Is there just have an idea? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't. Actually, I'm trying to. So there is a no longer that recent edited collection that globalizes the history of smallpox and vaccination, and it does have a chapter on Japan. And what I recall is that that when the Meiji state decided to do it, it was actually, they did it with a considerable amount of force. But don't quote me on that. There is an essay in this collection that does actually treat Japan. And I think I have already addressed a bunch of those components of that kind of global story, or at least across the empire story. It was fascinating to track, actually, the second place to have compulsory vaccination in the world was Tasmania. So that happened 6 weeks after it happened in Britain. The newspaper arrived and they said, let's do it. And I'll come in, let me see if there's a person. Does anyone have a question out there who hasn't had a chance to speak yet? Yes, right there.
I'm John.
Hi, John.
I'm a senior economics major here at Villanova. Thank you for your talk. My question was just if the British state at the time provided any incentives to British citizens to get vaccinated to counter the anti-vaccination movement and seal the movement at the time.
So the literature, there's a handbook on vaccination by Fry, which was the classic one. And there's a passage in it, I was preparing a lot for this lecture, and I thought, what questions are people going to ask me? Where it says, various localities could provide, I can't remember the 19th century word, inducements, but I don't know what they were. I mean, they hoped that the biggest inducement would be the health of the child. They were much more concerned, really, the focus of this movement seems to be about producing disincentives to not vaccinate, so a series of negatives. And the idea was, even conscientious objection was structured in a way to make it a real bother and a hassle for a poor person to get an exemption, because they had to go before two magistrates. So they had to take off time from work. And I think we know working poor people don't have a lot of extra time to do that. They had to find magistrates. They then had to get a certificate of exemption. They had to pay a small amount of money for it. And they had to participate in making sure, along with the person who gave it, that it got filed with the proper authorities. And Lord Salisbury very cynically said, they're not going to do it. That the number of parents who would actually go through that bother and who have real conscientious objections is so small that this is the surest way to make sure that negligent parents vaccinate their kids. And he did something else, which is the opposite of an incentive in a certain level, so I wish I could answer it more precisely. 1898 made possible domiciliary vaccination, so that poor parents didn't have to go somewhere to get their kids vaccinated. The public vaccinator now came to your house and performed it. And you needed to show a certificate of exemption when that person came in order to not have that happen. So that wasn't I did a terrible job answering your question about the inducements, but I piled on more about the incentives to comply with the law. Great.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. It's fascinating, and particularly around the vaccination. My question is about conscience and India. And I'm sure you know this and you've thought a lot about this. What would pundits have thought of the idea of conscience and how you defined it at the beginning of the talk? Of the prick of conscience preventing us from doing something wrong. Is that necessary? I mean, how does that square? What would that be in Sanskrit?
Right. So the article that Mark referred to is set in British India, and it looks at the kind of genealogies of conscience there. So within Islamic thought, They're highly, highly developed ethical ideas that map very easily onto conscience. And Syed Ahmed Khan, in his history of the Great Rebellion, his history of the Indian Mutiny, actually makes an explicit argument that Hindus know nothing of conscience and care nothing of it. Muslims, of course, do. And this is because of the akhlaq and a series of ethical moral traditions that are part of a kind of Persian Islamic world of ethical thought. So within Islamic India, there is not much of a problem in translating conscience, in a sense, because within the deep genealogy of Islamic Indian thought, it incorporates the Hellenistic ideas, Persian ideas, Islamic thought are together. Now, the question of conscience in Hinduism is a kind of interesting matter. My argument is that while Ramaran Roy, who is the first great, let's say the most famous of the great westernizing intellectual reformers in India, he grabs conscience because he needs it as part of his argument about the free will choices, the debate around the free will choices of the woman who self-immolates. Roy finds sati an offense, and part of his discourse is to use liberal ideas of conscience as a way to transform his own world and forms of Brahminical Hinduism. So conscience figures in Roy's writings. And in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, people who were followers of Roy also elaborate pretty detailed ideas of conscience. But my work shows the extent to which Indian intellectuals and activists, my work is focusing on Western India and Maharashtra, refuse to use the word conscience or to play into it, which they see as a Western and foreign import that is incompatible with the nature of their ethical and religious lives. And so I chart the studious refusal of the discourse of conscience and the refusal to be governed by conscience, which Christian missionaries and the Viceroy Dalhousie briefly attempt to impose on Indian subjects on the eve of 1857. Britain decides that governance by conscience is a really bad idea when they almost lose, when India becomes a site of huge armed conflict. And they believe that they need to be wary of imposing Christian conscience on non-Christian peoples in India. This changes in the years between around 1880 and 1890 with the formation of the Indian National Congress. Members of that Indian National Congress, which is initially convened at the behest of Mary Hume Rothery's younger brother, Alan Octavian Hume. He joins together with activist anti-colonial nationalist intellectuals, and they have the first meeting of the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress members see conscience as a usable tool to beat the British colonial state. And they use it to say, as in some of the arguments that I quoted here, don't Indians have conscience? How can you have a universal Christian idea of conscience and yet also have what Edmund Burke called moral geographies? In other words, what's true in one place isn't true in another, or what I call conscience by latitudes. So in the 1880s, and so I've given you a pretty specific answer. So my argument is, in the early years, between around 1800 and 1820, the circle of Ramaran Roy used conscience. By and large, groups of people who self-name themselves as Orthodox Hindus abjure conscience. They see it as a trap. They see it as a way to be drawn into Western political and ethical questions, and they refuse it as part of a gesture of anti-colonialism. By the 1880s and 90s, Indian nationalists see it as a strategic ploy because they're able to say, why don't we have consciences? If you've been here for 100 years making us into liberal moral subjects, surely we should now have the right to exercise our consciences. So they use conscience against the colonial state. So it's a very shifting terrain in at least the way that I am, at this point in my research, charting the kind of history of conscience in British India.
Thank you. That's great. I guess we'll close the proceedings at this moment, and if anybody has any questions individually, they can ask that. We can hang around a little bit.
Well,
Is this going to be posted somewhere? I'm sure a lot of people would love to see this.
Yes.
Okay.
and thank you all for being a wonderful audience and for the honor of bringing me home to Villanova.